On the far edge of Cedar Hollow, where the pines stand shoulder to shoulder against the winter wind, one quiet night carried a turning point no one saw coming. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just a door that didn't close all the way, and a small life that arrived exactly when a man most needed something to hold on to. The night began like so many others for Ethan Marlowe. Slow, deliberate, shaped by long habits and an even longer stretch of silence. Outside, snow pressed against the cabin windows, blurring the world into soft shapes. Inside, the wood stove hummed its low melody, filling the room with the kind of warmth that never quite reached the corners. Winter in Cedar Hollow had its own way of shrinking life into smaller spaces, asking people to move gently, to speak softly, to accept that daylight doesn't stay long. Ethan moved through the kitchen with the familiar stiffness of someone who knew every board that creaked. His hands, weathered by decades of carpentry, carried a mug of chamomile tea to the same chair he sat in every night. He eased himself down slowly, waiting for his knee to settle. At 71, the body made more suggestions than he cared to admit. And in a house that had held two people for most of its years, the quiet sometimes felt bigger than the rooms themselves. On the table sat a single candle, its flame wavering in the draught that snuck under the door. He lit it every evening, not for ritual, not for memory, but for a sense of company. His late wife, Georgia, had loved candlelight. She used to say a small flame could calm a whole room if you let it. After she passed, the flame became something else too. Gentleness, continuity, a quiet kind of loyalty. Not far from Ethan's feet, Luna, his cream-gray short hair, stretched herself along the braided rug. She rarely wandered far from him when the wind blew hard. Cats understood storms in ways people couldn't, and she seemed to sense the heaviness winter brought to Ethan's chest. Her presence was soft but certain, a quiet anchor that made the cabin feel less empty. Every so often, Ethan still spoke to Georgia as though she was sitting in her old rocking chair by the window. He didn't do it out loud anymore, just small thoughts that floated up without asking. You'd say the snow looks peaceful tonight. You'd remind me I don't have to finish the whole day at once. You'd probably laugh at how much Luna bosses me around now. Grief had changed over the years. It didn't punch like it once did. Now it felt more like a room in the house he still walked into by accident. Familiar, quiet, dimly lit. Love doesn't vanish. It just rearranges itself. That night, Ethan noticed Luna shifting repeatedly, lifting her head toward the mudroom door. He didn't think much of it at first. Wind rattled the siding in unpredictable ways, and strange noises traveled strangely across snow-covered ground. But Luna wasn't just listening. She was waiting. Then came that sound. A soft, hesitant scrape against the pet door. A pause. Another scrape. Ethan set his mug down. "Luna?" he said under his breath, though he knew she couldn't answer. She had been inside with him, so whatever was pushing at the door wasn't her. His chest tightened, but not with fear, more with an instinct he didn't question. He reached for the lantern, lit it carefully, and walked toward the mudroom with slow, steady steps. The cabin wasn't large, but in the winter, quiet. Each footfall sounded louder than it should. When he reached the mudroom, the pet door hung half open. Snow had blown in around the edges, leaving a thin dusting on the floorboards. And standing just inside, shivering, exhausted, covered in patches of ice, was Luna. But she wasn't alone. Clamped gently between her jaws was a tiny bobcat cub. Ethan froze, not because he was afraid, but because the sight didn't seem possible. The cub was no bigger than a loaf of bread, its fur matted with frost, its body limp. Luna stepped forward, with a sort of trembling determination, as if she'd used every ounce of strength she had left just to bring the little creature home. A warm flush moved through Ethan's chest, something between shock and tenderness. He knelt slowly, joints protesting, lantern light pooling across the wooden floor. "Good girl," he whispered, voice thick. "It's all right. I've got you now." Luna lowered the cub onto the rug, then collapsed beside it, her sides rising and falling in quick, short bursts. She touched her nose to the cub's cheek, a small, instinctive gesture of reassurance, the kind of kindness animals give without hesitation or need for recognition. Ethan positioned the lantern closer. The cub wasn't moving, not really. Its breathing was faint, shallow, a thin whimper, so soft it was barely a sound, a pest from it. Something primal clicked in Ethan's mind, the part of him that had helped orphaned kittens in barns when he was a boy, the part that understood that warmth is sometimes the only medicine the world can offer. He gently slipped his hands beneath the cub, surprised by how cold it felt. And as he lifted it, a thought he hadn't felt in years surfaced. This little one needs me. It wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. The cabin seemed to understand. He carried the cub and Luna both to the living room, placing them near the stove. The old iron beast radiated steady heat, reliable, comforting, something Ethan could trust. He pulled a wool blanket from the couch and wrapped the cub carefully, leaving just enough space for air to touch its tiny nose. Luna curled close, grooming its fur slowly, though her own legs trembled with exhaustion. Ethan moved gently, quietly, warming towels, feeding the fire, adjusting the blanket, guided by instinct more than knowledge. He'd never handled a wild bobcat before, but right now, it wasn't a creature of the wilderness. It was a fragile, living heartbeat lying in his hands, and instinct told him that the smallest acts still mattered. What amazed Ethan most wasn't the cub, it was Luna. How far had she gone in that storm? How had she found it? What had driven her to carry a creature twice the weight of anything she'd ever dragged home before? He didn't know, but he felt the shape of the answer. Some animals simply refuse to ignore suffering. Some hearts, quiet, unassuming, steady, step forward when needed. And maybe people weren't so different. As Ethan settled onto the floor beside them, snow drifting softly beyond the window, he felt something shift inside him. Not a dramatic awakening, not a rush of hope, just a small, warm looseness in the chest. The kind that arrives when life hands you something unexpected, yet strangely welcome. Maybe healing doesn't always begin with joy. Maybe it begins with a life smaller than your palm, reminding you you're still capable of love. This thought lingered as he watched Luna and the cub breathe side by side, their bodies rising and falling in an almost matching rhythm. Outside, the storm eased. The candle on the table flickered, and in a cabin that had been quiet for too long, something gentle began to unfold. If you've ever had a moment like this, where something small changed everything, feel free to share it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. By morning, Ethan would begin to understand just how extraordinary Luna's journey had been, and how the trail she left in the snow would lead Cedar Hollow toward a story none of them would ever forget. Long before Luna appeared in the doorway with the tiny bobcat cub, a journey had already unfolded, quiet, hidden, and nearly impossible. It wasn't a story anyone in Cedar Hollow witnessed. It was one only the snow could have told, if snow cared to speak. And yet, what happened out there in the dark showed just how far loyalty, instinct, and love can carry even the smallest of creatures. Most storms in Cedar Hollow arrive with a certain rhythm. Wind sweeping down from the high ridges, snow swirling in slow spirals before committing to its fall. But the storm that night descended without warning. A sudden white curtain dropped over the valley, swallowing the horizon, turning familiar paths into uncertain shapes. It was the kind of winter weather that asked everything in its way to stay still. But Luna didn't. It's hard to imagine what makes an old housecat push into a storm like that. Maybe it was a sound so faint only an animal could hear. Maybe it was something deeper, something in the quiet language animals share with the world. Whatever called her out into the night wasn't loud. It was simply persistent. She must have slipped out the pet door during one of the moments Ethan had dozed off, her small paw prints quickly lost beneath the falling snow. The cold met her instantly, sinking into her fur, threading between her ribs, yet she kept moving. Luna had never been a wanderer. She'd always stayed close to the cabin, content to watch birds from the window or nap by the stove. But that night, something pulled her beyond her usual borders. As she moved through the underbrush, the snow clung to her whiskers, weighing them down. The wind pushed against her body hard enough that she had to dig her claws in just to stay upright. She walked in slow, determined steps, one paw placed carefully before the next. Even a small stumble could have been dangerous. Winter isn't gentle with creatures her size. Somewhere in the distance, beneath the howl of the wind, she heard it again. A thin, quivering cry. Not the high chatter of pine squirrels, not the low groan of branches bending under snow. This was something smaller, more fragile, the sound of a life trying, with its last strength, to call for help. That faint cry guided Luna deeper into the storm. She moved between fallen logs and clusters of tightly packed furs, her ears twitching toward every small rustle. Snowflakes clung to her fur, forming icy beads along her back. Her tail curled low to the ground to keep her balance. And then she saw it. Half buried near a thicket, a small shape trembled beneath a snarl of wire. An old trap left abandoned. A bobcat cub, no more than a few weeks old, pressed its body tight against the ground. Its cries were barely breaths. The metal snare had tightened around a hind leg, and the storm had robbed the cub of almost all its warmth. For those who know the land around Cedar Hollow, it's not uncommon for bobcat cubs to wander when frightened. Their mothers leave them tucked in safe places while they hunt. But in winter, even a brief separation can turn dangerous. Deep snow confuses scent trails. The smallest fear can drive a young animal too far from its den. And traps, illegal though they may be, still hide along forgotten property lines or places where old habits died slower than the rules. A cub caught like that doesn't last long. Exposure alone can take its life within hours, and without its mother's warmth and guidance, its chances shrink even more. Luna approached slowly, her body low to the snow. The cub turned its head, eyes dim, barely able to lift itself. There was no hiss, no growl, just a tiny, exhausted exhale. Luna sniffed the air around the snare, then circled it once, studying the metal with a wary gaze. To imagine her next actions is to recognize something universal, the quiet courage that surfaces when a vulnerable life lies before you. She placed her paws against the snow, bracing her small body. Then she bit the wire. Not a gentle nibble, a determined pull. The cold metal cut against her gums. Her teeth slipped twice. But she tried again. Her whiskers shook with the effort. Snow gathered across her back in a growing sheet. Still, she held on. The trap resisted at first, rust stiffening its coil. But Luna didn't release her grip. She twisted her body, using her weight as leverage. The snare strained, then gave way with a faint metallic snap. The cub whimpered softly as if surprised by the sudden freedom. Luna moved closer, nudging it gently. The cub's body was too cold to stand. Its tiny paws curled inward, stiff from the wind. Luna began grooming its fur, licking away the snow, warming the delicate body beneath. With every stroke, her rough tongue urged life back toward the surface. Little by little, the cub's breathing steadied. Then came the hardest part, lifting it. The cub was heavier than anything Luna had ever carried. She hooked her jaws gently around the scruff of its neck, careful not to tighten her bite. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled. She paused, gathered what strength she had left, and tried again. Some journeys don't begin with confidence. They begin with the first step that doesn't fail. Luna walked slowly, each stride deliberate. The cub dangled from her jaws, too weak to hold its head up, its hind leg trembling from pain. Luna's paws sank deep into the snow with every step. The storm pressed against her side, pushing her off course. She adjusted, step by painstaking step, using the trees as shelter when the wind grew harsh. At one point, she stopped beneath a leaning pine, hiding from a sudden burst of icy air. She set the cub down just long enough to breathe. Her lungs heaved, her body shook. And yet, she leaned over the cub again, licking its ear as if to say, Not long now. The return trip stretched in ways only cold and exhaustion can measure. Perhaps she remembered the smell of the cabin, wood smoke, old pine boards, and Ethan's steady presence. Perhaps she simply trusted her paws. But somehow, through the storm that swallowed her tracks as quickly as she made them, she found her way home. Later, when Ethan saw them in the mudroom, Luna barely standing, the cub limp in her jaws, he would never have guessed the miles she crossed or the courage it took. But courage doesn't ask for witnesses. It simply acts. There's something deeply human in that image, even though it belongs to a cat. Sometimes, strength doesn't roar. Sometimes, it doesn't even speak. Sometimes, it's just a tired body choosing to keep going because something small and helpless needs warmth, protection, and a safe place to land. Love, in all its forms, kindness, loyalty, devotion, moves quietly, yet its impact is profound. And maybe that's what makes stories like Luna's stay with us. Not because they're extraordinary, though they are, but because they remind us of something we forget. That gentleness can be brave, that small acts can be heroic, and that even the softest hearts can rise to meet the storm. If you've ever witnessed an animal show unexpected kindness, or stepped in to protect something vulnerable, share it in the comments. Moments like these connect us more than we realize. By the time dawn touched Cedar Hollow, Luna and the cub lay resting near the stove, and Ethan was beginning to understand the weight of what she carried through the wind. But saving the cub was only the beginning. The real work and the quiet, healing transformation was just about to start. The storm outside had quieted, but inside Ethan's cabin another kind of storm gathered, one made of instinct, urgency, and a fragile life suspended between winter's cold and the promise of warmth. The first hours after Luna's return would decide everything, not through dramatic gestures, but through small, careful acts that carried more love than most people ever speak aloud. In the dim glow of the lantern, Ethan set Luna and the tiny bobcat cub near the old cast-iron stove. The heat radiated outward in soft waves, warming the wooden floor and sending gentle light up the log walls. The cabin had always been simple. No fancy furniture, no clutter, but on that night, it felt like a sanctuary. A place where a tired man, an aging cat, and a creature pulled from the edge of the wild might just find a way to hold on. Ethan knelt beside them, his knees protesting. He ignored the ache. Some moments don't wait for comfort. The cub lay wrapped in a wool blanket, its small sides barely moving. Its breathing was shallow, so faint Ethan had to lean close to make sure it was still there. Luna pressed her body against the cub's, not quite touching it first, then inching closer, as though guided by something she didn't have to think about. Her tail curled protectively, her eyes half closed from exhaustion, but still aware. Instinct didn't sleep, even when the body begged for rest. Anyone familiar with wildlife, especially bobcats in winter, knows how precarious these first hours can be. Cold does more than chill. It slows the heart, it weakens reflexes, it steals the natural warmth that keeps small creatures alive. In nature, a cub this young depends entirely on its mother's body heat. Without it, survival becomes a race against time. Ethan didn't know the science in exact terms, but he understood enough. He'd grown up on farms where newborn animals sometimes needed help making it through nightfall. He remembered his father placing cold farm kittens under warm towels, rubbing their small bodies gently until life pulsed back into them. That memory guided him now. He rose slowly, bracing himself on the stove's iron handle, and moved into the tiny laundry alcove. He pulled out 2 thick towels, folded them carefully, and laid them on the stove's hearthstone to warm. The movements came naturally, steady, calm, respectful, as though rushing might disturb the fragile balance unfolding behind him. When he returned to Luna and the cub, he lifted the small bundle again. The cub stirred weakly, a soft whimper escaping its throat. Ethan's heart tightened. That sound, thin, uncertain, felt like a plea. Not a dramatic cry, just a whisper of need. He placed the warmed towels around the cub, layering them with gentle hands. "Easy now," he murmured. "We'll get you warm." His voice had a way of softening when he took care of something small. Georgia used to tease him about it. She'd say he talked to kittens the same way he talked to her on quiet Sunday mornings, soft, steady, with a mix of kindness and caution. Ethan felt her memory nudge him, not painfully, but like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He reached for his wife's old flannel shirt folded on the chair nearby. Georgia had worn it on cool evenings while reading by the window. He laid it gently inside the crate he'd turned into a makeshift bed. Its scent faint, but familiar. Not for sentimentality, though that was part of it, but because it was soft and warm, and warmth mattered most right now. Luna lifted her head as he lowered the cub onto the flannel. She moved closer, tucking herself around it like a small crescent moon. The cub's breathing steadied slightly, its tiny paws flexing once, as if testing whether the world was still safe to trust. Ethan watched them with a quiet awe he couldn't quite name. He went to the kitchen, his steps slow but determined, and filled a small ceramic bowl with warm water. Not hot, just enough heat to ease the chill from Luna's bones and maybe coax the cub's strength back. He dipped a cloth into the bowl and wrung it out carefully before returning to them. He dabbed gently at the cub's fur, wiping away the dirt, the ice, the little flecks of snow that clung stubbornly to its coat. With each careful touch, he felt something inside him loosen. A knot he hadn't realized had tightened over years of grief and solitude. The cub stirred slightly at the warm cloth, a bare hint of response. That was enough to make Ethan swallow hard. Luna watched him, her eyes not quite tired, not quite alert, somewhere in between. She licked the cub's ear, repeating a pattern that looked ancient, instinctive, as if it had been written into her bones long before she found her way to this cabin. Ethan paused for a moment, resting his hand on the floor for support. The lantern on the table cast a soft halo of gold around them, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. Not in the way it had since Georgia passed. Not in the way winter often sharpened loneliness. It felt needed, and that stirred something tender inside him. Maybe this is what love looks like, he thought. Not grand gestures or declarations, but simple actions. Warm towels, whispers, a steady presence in the dark. Protecting what cannot protect itself. Holding life in your hands with care, even if it's small and wild and not yours to keep. And maybe this is why stories like this stay with us. Not because they're extraordinary, though they are, but because they remind us of the best parts of being human. The parts that rise instinctively when faced with vulnerability. The parts that choose compassion even when the outcome is uncertain. In a world that often moves too fast, moments like this, slow, attentive, grounded, feel almost sacred. Ethan watched Luna curl herself more tightly around the cub. Her breathing slowed, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. He tucked the blankets around them gently, creating a cocoon of warmth. The cabin's silence held them together. Three living beings, different in every possible way, bound by a single shared truth. Life was fragile, and caring for it mattered. As the hours passed, Ethan stayed awake, feeding the fire, checking on the cub's breathing, whispering encouragement to Luna. Now and then he reached out to rest a hand on the flannel shirt, feeling the warmth spreading beneath it. He didn't know if the cub would make it, but he knew this. He would give it every chance he could. Not because he felt obligated, but because in that moment, protecting this tiny creature felt like a way of honoring everything he'd ever loved. Georgia, Luna, the years he'd spent building things that lasted. Some acts are simple, some are small, but some feel like a quiet promise. As long as you're here, you won't face the night alone. If you've ever spent a night caring for something fragile, an animal, a memory, or even a piece of yourself, share it below. Someone out there may need to hear they're not the only one who stayed awake for kindness. By dawn, the cub's breathing had steadied, and a thin line of pink touched the snow outside the window. But keeping wildlife alive in winter is never as simple as one warm night. As the days unfolded, the seasons within the cabin would shift in ways Ethan never expected, revealing not just the cub's slow recovery, but the quiet thawing of something inside him as well. Before anyone in Cedar Hollow learned what Luna had done, The cabin itself became the quiet stage for a different kind of miracle, one that unfolded slowly, the way ice melts from the edges of a river. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just the gentle passing of days, each carrying a small piece of healing for both Ethan and the tiny bobcat cub he'd begun calling Coda in his journal. Winter lingered long that year, stretching its white blanket over the hills with a kind of weary patience. But inside Ethan Marlowe's cabin, the world was measured not by storms or frost, but by the soft rhythm of breath coming from a small wooden crate near the stove. Every morning began the same way, with Ethan easing his stiff body from bed, rubbing warmth back into his hands, and kneeling by the crate to check on Luna and Coda. He kept his voice low, knowing instinctively that gentleness mattered. "Easy there," he'd whisper. "We're still here." Those first few mornings, Coda barely stirred. His eyes stayed closed, saving what little strength he had. Luna remained curled around him, her breathing steady, her body offering the warmth his wild mother might have given if the world had unfolded differently. Animals, especially bobcats, heal in quiet, incremental waves. A cub recovering from shock won't bounce back all at once. Instead, strength returns through tiny signs: a lifted head, a twitch of the ear, a soft sound made without fear. Patience is the real medicine. Warmth is the anchor, and the presence of something steady, a familiar voice, a constant touch, a mothering companion, often matters more than anything else. Ethan didn't know all the biology behind it, but he understood the shape of healing. After losing Georgia, he'd learned that heartbreak doesn't disappear in sudden bursts. It softens around the edges, one quiet day at a time. Maybe that's why he settled into the routine so naturally. Not because he had answers, but because he recognized the process. One morning, about a week after Luna's journey through the storm, Ethan set a shallow dish of warm broth near the crate. He wasn't sure if Coda was ready for it, but as the steam curled into the air, the cub lifted his head just an inch, just long enough to breathe in the scent. Luna nudged him gently, as if giving permission. Coda's tiny nose twitched. Then, with the slow determination of a creature discovering its own will again, he leaned forward and lapped once, barely a sip. But to Ethan, it felt like watching a sunrise after a long night. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "That's it," he murmured, voice soft. "You're getting there." It wasn't much. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt like a small victory, one that the cabin held on to. And sometimes that's how hope arrives. Not in grand gestures, but in a sip of broth taken by a fragile creature who wants to keep trying. The days moved slowly, marked by subtle changes. Winter stayed close at first, brushing frost across the windows and creaking the cabin's old frame. But inside, warmth grew, Luna recovering her strength, Coda beginning to sit up on wobbling legs, Ethan stoking the stove with more care than he used for himself. As the first thaw arrived, it brought small shifts. The icicles along the porch began dripping in slow, steady beats. The sun lingered a little longer on the kitchen table, and Coda started exploring the cabin in cautious, hesitant steps, sniffing the air, pawing at dust motes, climbing the lowest bookshelf like it was a fallen log in the forest. Every milestone felt like a moment worth remembering. Ethan wrote them down in George's old notebook. Simple notes, sometimes just a sentence or two. Coda stood for the first time today. Luna taught him how to groom behind the ears. He chirped when I walked in, almost like he recognized me. The act of writing grounded him. It gave shape to the days. It offered a sense of purpose that had been missing since Georgia passed. And then came spring, soft and slow. The first patch of wild grass outside the cabin pushed through the snow. The first birds returned to the pine branches. There were moments when Ethan would sit in his rocking chair and simply watch Luna and Coda sleeping side by side. The cub's breathing is now deeper, steadier. Luna's aging body was still offering warmth, though her movements were slower than before. And Ethan found himself thinking, maybe life isn't about the big turning points. Maybe it's about the small days in between, the ones that reshape us without warning. He felt gratitude in unexpected ways. Gratitude for the warmth of the stove, for the presence of Luna's quiet loyalty, for Coda's stubborn will to live. Gratitude for the way caring for something vulnerable seemed to thaw parts of his heart he thought had frozen permanently. Sometimes healing isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's slow, almost invisible, like the way snow melts under early spring sun, drop by drop. Something changed in Ethan, too. The cabin didn't feel haunted by absence anymore. It felt lived in again, filled, not with noise, but with meaning, with companionship, with the soulful presence of two creatures who had found their way into his story without intending to. Once, while pouring himself coffee, Ethan caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. Tired eyes, yes, but softer than they'd been in years. A man rediscovering something he'd forgotten. The quiet joy of nurturing life, of offering kindness simply because it was needed. And he realized something. Protecting Coda wasn't just about saving the cub. It was saving something in himself. In a world that often celebrates speed, achievement, and the loudest voices, there's something profoundly healing about witnessing life return slowly. A bobcat cub finds strength in a warm corner of a cabin. A man finding purpose in the gentle act of caring. A housecat offering loyalty, not with grandeur, but with soft fur and steady presence. These moments remind us that kindness doesn't need applause. Love doesn't need to be shouted. Healing doesn't need to be rushed. Sometimes the most heartwarming stories grow quietly, like seeds opening beneath snow. If you've ever watched something or someone heal in slow, unexpected ways, feel free to share your story below. Your quiet moment might encourage someone waiting for their own thaw. By the time Cedar Hollow's snow finally receded from the roads, word had begun to slip through town about the wild cub living up at Ethan's place. And soon the people around him, friends, neighbors, even those he hadn't spoken to in months, would step into the story, each bringing their own fears, hopes, and gentle truths. In small towns, stories rarely stay hidden. They travel on cold morning air, slip between conversations at the diner, and settle into the hearts of people who still believe kindness is worth paying attention to. And in Cedar Hollow, the story of an old man, a loyal housecat, and a rescued bobcat cub began to drift from porch to porch long before Ethan realized anyone knew. By early spring, the roads leading into town had cleared enough that Ethan could make the slow drive to the market. He didn't go often these days. His knees made long walks painful, and the quiet of the cabin suited him better than crowded aisles. But he needed a few things: fresh produce, more firewood bundles, and, if he were honest with himself, the comfort of seeing familiar faces again. News of harsh weather and winter hardships is usually what stirs conversation in Cedar Hollow. But this particular morning, something else sat underneath the usual greetings. People paused a second longer when they saw Ethan. They tilted their heads. Their smiles softened in a way he didn't understand at first. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a concern. It was something gentler, like knowing there was more to his winter than he was letting on. He didn't learn why until the bell above the market door jingled open behind him, and Raymond Bennett stepped inside. Raymond, retired wildlife officer, steady as the mountains he used to patrol, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Heard you've had company these last few weeks," he said. Ethan blinked. "Company?" Raymond gave a quiet half smile. "Word gets around. And in Cedar Hollow it does. Small towns don't need newspapers to share news. Stories move through everyday moments. A neighbor notices footprints near your porch. Someone catching a glimpse of you, carrying extra blankets inside. A passing comment at the diner about hearing strange little chirps on the wind. And sometimes a child overhearing an adult say, "I think Ethan's caring for a wild cub up there." None of it spreads maliciously. It spreads the way warmth does. Slowly, naturally, because people care, and because the wilderness around them is woven into their way of life. Raymond walked beside Ethan through the store, asking him to tell it in his own words. Ethan hesitated at first, unsure how much to share, but as he spoke, softly, cautiously, Raymond listened without judgment. He listened the way old friends do, not for facts, but for truth. Ethan explained Luna's disappearance, her return, the cub's condition, and the slow recovery unfolding inside his cabin. He omitted the fear he felt, the sleepless nights, and the moments when he believed the tiny creature might slip away despite all their care. Those details felt private, fragile, meant for the notebook he kept by the stove. When Ethan finished his story, Raymond exhaled slowly. "You know," he said, "bobcat cubs don't survive storms like that on their own. Not without a miracle. Or someone stepping in." Ethan looked down, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "It wasn't me. It was Luna." Raymond shook his head gently. "Maybe so. But you opened the door. You gave them a place to land." That simple observation settled deep in Ethan's chest. He hadn't thought of it that way, not as an act of love, but as something instinctive, something anyone would have done. But the way Raymond said it made him feel the weight of it, the goodness in it. There are times when another person naming your quiet act of kindness allows you to see its worth for the first time. Within days, the story found its way through Cedar Hollow like threads weaving themselves into a quilt. At Maple Diner, where early risers gathered for pancakes and hot coffee, people paused mid-sentence when the door opened, hoping it might be Ethan. They weren't looking for gossip. They were looking for reassurance that in a harsh world, kindness was still alive, somewhere up the mountain. At the hardware store, old-timers leaned against shelves talking about bobcats, their habits, their territories, the way they usually avoid humans. They spoke softly, with respect for the animals and admiration for what Luna had done. Someone recalled a winter decades ago when a farmer found a fox kit in his barn and kept it alive for weeks until spring. "Animals know," one man said. "They know when gentleness is needed." At the post office, while sorting letters, the clerk told a customer, "Makes you wonder how many wild stories are happening out there that we never hear about." Even at the church, during a quiet Wednesday gathering, someone mentioned Ethan in the closing prayer, not by name, but by intention. For those caring for small creatures this winter, may they feel supported, and may the little ones find strength. Ethan didn't know any of this yet. He was at home tending to Luna and Coda, writing notes in his journal, moving through days that felt fuller than they had in years. But the town was thinking of him, holding him, rooting for him. There's a beauty in being part of a community that listens, not just with ears, but with compassion. A town that doesn't intrude, but notices. A town that respects the quiet work of caring for something vulnerable. Cedar Hollow wasn't perfect. No place is. There were disagreements, old grudges, fences that needed mending. But beneath all that lay a shared understanding. Life is hard enough without carrying everything alone. So when someone in town showed courage or compassion, even in the smallest ways, people leaned in, not to take over, not to judge, just to witness. It's easy to assume that wildlife and community exist on separate paths, but in places like Cedar Hollow, the two are woven tightly. People here track seasons by the return of migrating birds, by the way deer gather in the meadow, by the soft call of owls at dusk. The wild isn't something outside their lives. It's part of their identity. So when the story of Ethan, Luna, and Coda spread, it didn't feel like an oddity. It felt like a reminder that people and animals often move through similar cycles of fragility and resilience. A reminder that caretaking, whether for loved ones, neighbors, or wild creatures, creates connections that strengthen an entire community. Stories like this become part of the town's fabric because they reflect who people want to be. Kind, loyal, attentive. They remind everyone that gentleness is not weakness. It's wisdom. A few days after seeing Ethan at the market, Raymond climbed the path to the cabin, crunching over the last patches of snow. He carried a bag of supplies, not because Ethan asked, but because that's what old friends do. They show up, quietly, with things that make someone's burden a little lighter. Ethan invited him in, and together they watched Coda bat gently at the corner of a blanket, his strength growing. Luna sat nearby, watching with the tired satisfaction of a creature who had given everything she had. Raymond knelt beside the cub, keeping his distance. "He's gonna make it," he said softly. Ethan nodded. I think so. And in that moment, a bond deepened, not just between the two men, but between the town and the wild story unfolding up here in the pines. If you're from a small town, or have ever been part of a community that showed up for you, feel free to share a memory below. Your story might remind someone the connection still matters. As spring spread through Cedar Hollow and Coda's strength returned, another shift began. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. The call of the wild, subtle but persistent, started to stir within him. And the next chapter of Ethan's unexpected journey would test not just his patience, but his heart. Long before Coda ever stepped beyond the cabin walls, the forest had already begun calling him back. Not with dramatic signs or sudden urges, but with quiet stirrings, small moments that hinted at a truth Ethan knew he would one day have to face. Healing had given the cub strength, and with strength came memory. Spring in Cedar Hollow arrives slowly, almost politely. Snow doesn't disappear all at once. It thins along the edges, trickles into creeks, softens under the afternoon sun. And as the world outside softened, something inside the cabin shifted too. Coda was no longer the trembling bundle Luna had carried through the storm. His legs grew firmer each week, his gaze more alert. His ears flicked at every new sound. Water dripping outside, a jay calling through the trees, the gentle rustle of wind against the house. These weren't just noises to him. They were invitations. At first, Ethan tried to pretend he didn't see the change. He watched Coda with a mixture of pride and dread, noticing the way the young bobcat moved with instinctive grace, the way he paused in doorways as though listening for something only he could hear. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Wild animals don't forget who they are. Even if they grow in safety, surrounded by warmth and care, the rhythms of their species are etched into them. Quiet, ancient, waiting. For a bobcat, that means curiosity that tilts toward independence, muscles shaped for climbing and stalking, a heart tuned to the pulse of open ground and whispering pines, a mind wired to explore, test, roam. Domestic comfort can soothe a wild creature, but it can't replace instinct. And instinct had begun to wake in Coda. It began one late morning when the sun stretched a soft beam across the living room. Dust floated in the light like tiny drifting snowflakes. Ethan was carving a small wooden spoon at the table when he noticed Coda crouched low, hind legs coiled, eyes locked on the dancing specks. And then he pounced. Not the clumsy, adorable hop of a house kitten. This was something sharper, more precise. A bobcat cub practicing his craft. Coda landed silently, his paws spread wide, tail twitching with satisfaction. He tried again, and again. Each time he grew more confident. Luna watched him from the rug with quiet acceptance. She didn't interfere. She didn't scold. She seemed to understand something Ethan was only beginning to grasp. This wasn't mischief. This was truth emerging. Another day, Coda discovered the bookshelf. To him, it wasn't a place that held novels and field guides. It was a mountain. He tested each shelf like a ledge, climbing with growing skill until he reached the top. Once there, he sat tall and still, surveying the room with an expression Ethan had seen before, on wild bobcats glimpsed briefly in the woods, their silhouettes blending into the trees. The sight tugged at Ethan's heart with a bittersweet pull. "You're remembering," he whispered. Coda blinked in slow acknowledgement. By early May, the snow had melted from the porch, revealing damp boards that smelled of pine and wet earth. Ethan often left the door ajar for fresh air, and Coda would wander toward it, sit just inside the frame, and lift his face to the breeze. He'd close his eyes, breathing in deeply. The scents carried stories. Damp soil, evergreen needles, distant water, something older than winter. Luna sometimes joined him, sitting at his side like a chaperone. But she never stepped outside. She simply observed the world with the calm of a cat who knew exactly where she belonged, and understood that Coda did not. Ethan stood behind them, watching their silhouettes in the light. Every instinct inside him wanted to close the door, just softly, just enough, as if buying one more day. But he didn't. Something inside him whispered, "Love doesn't lock doors." There were nights when Ethan lay awake, listening to Coda pad across the cabin. The young bobcat moved differently now. Light, alert, fluid. Every step sounded like an echo of the wild creeping closer. Ethan felt torn in a way he hadn't expected. Caring for Coda had filled the house with warmth again. Not the warmth of company, exactly, but of purpose. It reminded him of all the mornings he and Georgia had spent tending their garden, nursing seedlings to life. He liked the feeling of giving care. He liked the weight of responsibility, the quiet companionship in the evening. And yet, he knew Coda didn't belong to him. He knew the forest was not just calling. It was waiting. One night, unable to sleep, he opened his journal and wrote, "Love is not holding tight. It's holding gently, long enough for a life to find its strength." The words steadied him and hurt. Humans sometimes forget that the wild carries its own wisdom. We try to protect, shelter, tame, believing safety is the highest form of love. But the world has room for many kinds of love. Some keep close, some send forth. Watching Coda relearn his nature offered Ethan a perspective he didn't expect. That healing isn't always about staying. Sometimes healing prepares us to leave. And that realization brought a quiet, bittersweet kind of peace. It reminded him of Georgia, how she taught him that fences don't keep love in, only fear. How she said the forest was beautiful because it refused to stay small. And how, at the end of her life, he had to let her go too. Then came a morning when the wild calling became unmistakable. Ethan opened the door to let the spring air in. Coda approached as usual, sitting in the doorway. But this time, he didn't stay seated. He stepped one paw onto the porch, then another. His ears twitched at every sound, the chatter of birds, the rustle of branches. Ethan's chest tightened. "Easy," he murmured. Coda looked back at him, not in fear, not in confusion, but in a way that seemed to say, "I know you. I'm grateful, but I'm also becoming who I'm meant to be." And then, without stepping any further, he returned inside. It wasn't time yet, but it was coming. Ethan felt it the way people feel shifts in the weather, subtle, undeniable, woven into the air. Have you ever cared for something, someone, an animal, even a hope, only to realize you eventually had to let it grow beyond you? Share your stories. They might help someone walking through their own doorway moment. As spring deepened and Coda's instincts continued to sharpen, the day Ethan had quietly feared began drawing near. The day when the cub who survived winter would step into a larger world. And what followed would become one of Cedar Hollow's most beloved stories of love, loyalty, and letting go. There comes a moment in every story, quiet, unhurried, but unmistakable, when one chapter recognizes it's time to hand itself to the next. And in Ethan's cabin, after months of warmth, healing, and small miracles, that moment arrived not with drama, but with a soft dawn, a cracked porch board, and a young bobcat ready to step into the life he was meant for. Spring had settled fully into Cedar Hollow by the time that day came. The last patches of snow had retreated into the shadows. Pine needles glowed deep green in the morning sun. The world outside no longer felt like a test of endurance. It felt like an invitation. Coda sensed it before Ethan did. He woke earlier than usual, climbing down from the windowsill with a quiet elegance that had grown into him over the weeks. His paws landed softly, almost soundless, as though he'd learned to place each step not just on the cabin floor, but on the edge between two worlds. Luna watched him from her favorite rug, eyes half open. She didn't move, but something about her stillness felt intentional, as if she knew the script of this moment long before Ethan understood it. Ethan stretched, joints complaining as they always did. But when he turned and saw Coda sitting at the door, upright, steady, tail curled loosely around his paws, something inside him shifted. Not a jolt, not a shock, more like the subtle click of understanding falling into place. He opened the door. The morning light spilled across the threshold in muted gold. It lit Coda's whiskers, the faint ripple of muscle beneath his young coat, the way his ears tilted toward the forest, as though listening for a voice he'd heard only in dreams. For a bobcat, growing strong means growing independent. Strength isn't meant to be kept inside four walls. It's meant to serve instincts that run deeper than memory. Marking a territory, learning to hunt, mapping ridgelines and creek beds, forming a solitary rhythm in a landscape built for quiet hunters. Humans can care for a wild animal for a season, maybe even save its life, but the forest, vast, uncontained, soulful, is the only place where a bobcat truly belongs. Ethan knew this. He'd known it for weeks. Knowing didn't soften the ache. Coda stepped onto the porch with delicate precision. His paws touched the old wooden boards Ethan had repaired countless times, each creak sounding like a memory. He paused at the edge. The forest opened before him, branches swaying gently, sunlight pouring through in soft ribbons, the faint call of a distant bird that only wild creatures recognize as meaningful. Ethan stood a few steps behind him, hands loosely at his sides. He didn't call out, didn't whisper, didn't bargain with the moment, though part of him wanted to. Coda turned his head and looked back. That single glance held more emotion than any words Ethan could have spoken. A kind of acknowledgement. A thank you, perhaps. Or maybe just the silent recognition that some bonds don't depend on staying close. They depend on being true. And then Coda stepped into the grass. Not running, not hesitating, just walking, with the natural confidence of an animal who had survived winter, healed in warmth, and rediscovered his nature. He moved toward the tree line, paused once more, and disappeared into the brush, quiet as a breath. Ethan stayed on the porch long after the forest swallowed Coda's silhouette. His hands rested on the railing, fingers tracing grooves he'd carved years ago. The breeze tugged softly at his sleeves, carrying scents of pine and damp earth. He felt the ache, yes, a heaviness in the chest that comes from caring deeply. But beneath the ache was something gentler, gratitude. Not everyone gets to witness a life come back from the edge. Not everyone gets to be part of a journey that begins with fear and ends with freedom. He thought of Georgia, of the way she'd cared for stray animals or tired neighbors or wilting plants. She used to say, "If something fragile finds you, there's a reason. You don't have to keep it. Just help it find its strength." Maybe she would have stood beside him now, watching the trees. Maybe she already was. The forest had a way of holding more than just wind. Inside the cabin, Luna curled into a tight ball and slept. For the first time in weeks, her body relaxed completely, as though some chapter of her purpose had also come full circle. Word of Coda's return to the wild spread through Cedar Hollow with the same tenderness that had carried the story of his rescue. At Maple Diner, customers smiled quietly when someone mentioned seeing fresh tracks by the creek. At the feed store, a clerk pointed out that the turkeys had been acting alert. Might be a young bobcat nearby. Children passing the Marlowe cabin on bikes whispered to each other, wondering if they might glimpse a pair of pointed ears behind the brush. The story didn't divide the town. It united them. It reminded people that kindness ripples outward, softly, deeply, touching more lives than we ever realize. A man in his 70s, a housecat with fierce devotion, and a bobcat cub who found healing in a wooden crate. These were not the ingredients of a grand legend, but in the hearts of those who lived there, the story carried something timeless. The belief that love, loyalty, and gentle acts still shape the world, even long after a small creature has stepped into the trees. Weeks passed. Spring warmed into early summer. Now and then Ethan found small signs near the cabin, Tracks by the shed, a tuft of fur caught on the fence, pine needles disturbed in patterns familiar to anyone who had watched a bobcat move. Coda didn't return, not yet, but the forest let Ethan know he was there. Children from town began stopping by on weekends, drawn partly by curiosity, partly by the comforting safety of stories told by someone who'd lived enough life to speak with kindness. They gathered on the porch, Luna purring at their feet, and listened as Ethan shared the tale, not to impress, not to boast, but to remind them of what gentleness can accomplish. Each child carried the story home, and the story grew a little more each time they did. Legacy doesn't always look like monuments or headlines. Sometimes it looks like a bobcat cub, healed and set free, whose journey teaches a town to look at the wild with softer eyes. Sometimes it looks like a community remembering that small lives, even wild ones, matter. If a small life, a pet, a wild creature, even a passing moment has ever changed you, feel free to share it below. Your story might reach someone who needs a quiet reminder that kindness echoes farther than we know. Coda's leaving wasn't the end. Not for Ethan, not for Luna, and not for Cedar Hollow. Seasons continued to turn, carrying new chapters with them, and what happened in the years that followed would deepen the story into something larger, something tender, lasting, and filled with a quiet wisdom of love offered freely. When a wild creature walks back into the forest, the world doesn't go silent. Something lingers, something softer, quieter, but deeply alive. The leaving is only half the story. The other half is what remains in the hearts of the people who cared, the places that sheltered life, and the quiet corners where memory settles like morning light. The cabin changed after Coda stepped into the trees, though not in the way Ethan feared. At first, the silence felt a little sharper, like winter trying to return. The space near the stove where Coda once slept felt unusually still. The doorway where he used to pause before listening to the wind seemed larger, emptier. And yet, as days passed, Ethan realized the cabin wasn't lonely. It was simply waiting. Seasons do that. They leave room for return, for the possibility of familiar footsteps, for the soft reminder that love doesn't end when someone walks away. It expands to fill new places, sometimes in ways we don't expect. In nature, bobcats often roam miles of territory. Their patterns follow food, shelter, instinct, and the changing seasons. A young bobcat might not come back to the same doorstep, but the forces that shaped his early survival, kindness, warmth, love, become part of the invisible architecture of his life. And in humans, those forces build something too. Meaning, purpose. A sense that our small, soulful moments matter more than we admit. Some returns aren't footprints in the snow. Some returns are lessons that stay behind. That's what Ethan discovered as the months passed. It was mid-autumn, leaves gold and copper, air crisp, when Ethan first saw the sign. Not Coda himself, but a set of prints just beyond the porch. Perfect, clear, unmistakable. One track slightly larger than he remembered, another much smaller beside it. A cub, maybe two. Ethan knelt beside the tracks, brushing the edge with his thumb. He didn't need to see Coda's face to know. Some bonds don't require proof. And he didn't call out or search the tree line. He simply stood there, grateful. A few weeks later, he spotted movement at dusk, a shape near the edge of the clearing, steady, graceful, familiar. Coda watched the cabin for a few quiet seconds, ears forward, body calm. Then he melted back into the trees with a smaller shape at his side. He wasn't returning for care. He didn't need saving anymore. He was returning because this place had become part of his story, and Ethan felt something warm settle into him, a sense of peace, not tied to possession, but to connection. Something shared once in winter was returning in autumn, carried by instinct, memory, and something that looked a lot like loyalty. Etten Cannon found himself reflecting on how much the wild had changed him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that mattered. He moved through his days with a little more patience, a little more gentleness. His grief, once heavy and unmoving, now felt like something he could hold without pain. Sometimes healing arrives not as joy, but as stillness, the kind that lets you breathe again without realizing you'd been holding your breath. Luna, too, carried her own quiet transformation. She spent more time resting, her body slowing, her eyes softening with age. Ethan noticed the way she sometimes sat near the door, as though remembering the night she had stepped into the storm carrying a life in her jaws. Her purpose had been fulfilled, not with fanfare, but with love that crossed the boundary between tame and wild. In time, when Luna's final day came, she passed as gently as she lived, curled in her favorite patch of sunlight, her breath fading into the calm of afternoon. Ethan held her with gratitude rather than despair. She had given everything she had, and more. After burying her beneath the pine Georgia once decorated with lights each December, Ethan whispered a simple truth. "You saved him. And you saved me." The wind moved through the branches above him, not loudly, just enough to make the needles sway. And in that moment, he felt the forest listening. Cedar Hollow didn't forget Coda's story. It became part of the town's identity. One of those gentle, heartwarming stories passed around during long winters, reminding everyone that kindness bridges worlds. Children continued visiting Ethan's cabin, their hands cold from bike handlebars, their cheeks red from the wind. They sat at his porch steps, eager to hear about Luna's courage, Coda's recovery, and the mysterious ways wild animals carry love differently from humans, but no less sincerely. Ethan told the stories softly, never embellishing, never dramatizing. He spoke of loyalty, love, instinct, and the healing power of steady hands. He spoke in a way that honored both the wild and the tame, knowing the line between them is thinner than most people think. Over time, the town became a little more attentive to the wilderness around it. They reported illegal snares. They learned the patterns of bobcats. They left small, respectful offerings of clean water during dry summers. The story had changed them, not by teaching, but by touching. That is the power of moral stories and emotional storytelling. They root themselves in the heart, long before the mind realizes what has shifted. And in his cabin, Ethan felt Georgia's presence more clearly than he had in years, not as sorrow, but as comfort, as warmth. He realized she would have loved the whole thing, the wild cub, the healing, the small community moments, the love shared quietly between species. She would have believed it was meant to happen. Coda had grown into the life he was destined for. Ethan was growing into the one he had left. Both transitions felt natural, gentle, even beautiful. As the years passed, Ethan kept writing in the journal he once used to track Coda's recovery. But the entries changed. They became reflections, reminders, soft lessons he wanted to leave behind in case anyone needed them. One entry read, "Home is sometimes a place. Other times it's a moment, a creature, a season that shows up just when you need reminding that the world still holds kindness." And that, he realized, was the legacy. Not the story itself, but the way it helped people believe again. Before you go, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Think about the small acts of kindness that changed you. The moments that reminded you the world still has love, loyalty, and gentle truths woven through it. Stories like Coda's remind us that we are all caretakers of something fragile, whether it's a memory, an animal, or a part of ourselves. If this story brought you calm, hope, or a sense of connection, I invite you to like this video and subscribe for more soulful, heartwarming stories that honor nature, healing, and the quiet beauty of life. And if you feel moved to go one step further, consider leaving a super thanks or a small donation. Your kindness helps support wildlife rescue efforts, giving vulnerable animals, including bobcats, a second chance at life, warmth, and love. Thank you for being here.